Reporting from the UN as the war in Sri Lanka reached its peak. So what should the world do about such conflicts? Joining me again, the former Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans and Alan Kuperman, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Centre in Washington, D.C., also the author of The Limits of Humanitarian Intervention, Genocide in Rwanda. Right now, Sri Lanka seems to be saying that it is acceding to some international pressure to look into some of the actions, alleged human rights abuses, some have even said genocide during the war. Do you hold any hope, Gareth Evans, that they will actually do something about it, hold people accountable?
Well, not on their past record, which has been quite lamentable in terms of commissions of inquiry and everything else. It's a great pity that we've seen this from Sri Lanka because it is against the trend of the way the world is reacting to these internal crises. What previously was regarded as absolutely no one else's business is gradually moving to the stage as a result of this acceptance of the responsibility to protect doctrine, where it is acknowledged to be everyone's business, even though the delivery is sometimes pretty weak and the follow-through is not very smart, as was the case in Sri Lanka. We are making a difference.
Well, where exactly?
Take Kenya, for example. Take Kenya 18 months ago and compare and contrast that with Rwanda in 1994.
But Kenya was diplomatic.
Yeah, but of course it was a diplomatic solution, but that's what the responsibility to protect is all about. It's not just about sending in the Marines. This is the whole point. It is a combination of appropriate and effective responses, whatever is necessary to prevent and then to react to these catastrophic situations.
Do you believe, just as R2P was coming up, we had the Darfur genocide, called genocide by the United States. Nobody intervened there. Great sermons about
there was real problems
no
about
flight zones, military intervention. It hasn't happened.
There was real problems about a full-scale coercive military intervention, as any humanitarian worker will tell you. If they'd gone into all guns blazing Western Sudan, 2.5 million people in those refugee camps would have had their lives put at risk, and also it would have thrown into chaos the very fragile North-South peace agreement. The truth of the matter is that humanitarian intervention in the old 1990s sense is not the way of thinking about these situations. What is necessary is to think about a whole variety of strategies, of which military stuff is only the most extreme and only in very limited cases. But the important thing is to get this sense of engagement and responsibility, and that's changing. Attitudes are changing.
Okay, let me just read this for Mr. Kuperman. The starting point for the responsibility to protect is the simple but profound idea that states have a responsibility to protect their own civilians. This is not rocket science, says Don Hubert, Professor of International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. You disagree with R2P?
Well, it's not that I disagree with the principle. Of course, it's a wonderful principle to try to protect civilians. The problem is that the way we have implemented the responsibility to protect has actually backfired. It has actually
In what way?
Well, we say that we'll intervene if civilians are at risk. And so there are disgruntled groups around the world who realize if they can launch a rebellion or a secession, they can provoke their state to retaliate militarily, hurting civilians. And the strategy is to do that, to try to attract international humanitarian intervention, which these rebels think will help them achieve their political aims, whether it be independence or secession. And the reason they do this is because it has worked. It has worked repeatedly. And so this emerging norm of the R2P, which is intended to protect civilians, has backfired.
Well, maybe I missed something. Where has it worked, this idea that rebels can draw in intervention for their own benefit?
I can cite many cases, but the clearest one was Kosovo, where the rebels, and I interviewed them, I went and I interviewed them, and they said very, very clearly, we did not think we could defeat the Serbs. Our intention was to provoke the Serbs so that they would crack down against our civilians, so that the international community would come in and help us achieve independence. Well, and lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. We intervened militarily in 1999, and we recognized their independence in 2008.
Okay, so I covered that war, so I know about it, and I know about Bosnia as well. I mean, on the one hand, that was the result. They got their independence, Gareth.
Yeah, but I mean, remember, we had Milosevic with genocidal form out there, visible elsewhere in the region, Bosnia next door, and we saw the beginnings of another ethnic cleansing, genocidal situation. The world had to react to that. Of course, Alan's right. There was an element of provocation. There was an element of opportunism in the way the Kosovo Liberation Army did themselves contribute to the provocation, exactly the same way as there's often that element of duality provocation justification. But the basic need is to ensure that when these situations explode, the world does not turn its back the way it did in Rwanda. And the world did not turn its back in Kenya, and that remains, to me, the best example of this mind shift, which is fundamentally occurring. Right. It's very, very important.
I'm going to play you brought up Rwanda, I wanted to as well, and that's the title of Professor Kuperman's book. So I want to play you a bit of an interview with General Dallaire, the beleaguered UN peacekeeping commander in Rwanda. When you were first told that you were going to head the mission in Rwanda, how did you feel about that?
An overwhelming excitement.
1 year later, Romeo Dallaire would leave Rwanda a broken man. His mission a failure, having watched helplessly as more than 800,000 people perished in the genocide.
We could have actually saved hundreds of thousands. Nobody was interested.
Professor Kuperman, when you see that and you hear that and you saw what happened, as we did who covered it, I mean, there's no way you can say that the world shouldn't have intervened and that R2P is just fancy footwork and fancy thinking. Clearly the world should have intervened. It stands today as a massive failure, and presidents and secretary generals are still apologizing for what they didn't do back in 1994.
No, there's no question that once innocent civilians are being targeted for killing or ethnic cleansing, that we should try and do whatever we can to help them. What we shouldn't do is intervene in ways that help rebels. And in fact, in Rwanda, we had been doing that for several years prior to the genocide. We had sided with these rebels, these Rwandan Patriotic Front rebels, and they invaded, and then the best evidence is that they killed the president in April of 1994, and it was the Hutu extremists in Rwanda that responded to that. So my bottom line is that civil wars are horrible and they lead to killing of civilians. And so what we should be trying to do is discourage the outbreak of civil wars. And unfortunately, the R2P, as we've implemented it, encourages rebellions and civil wars. That's how it backfires.
That's nonsense on stilts, as Jeremy Bentham would have said. It just doesn't justify in any way the world's experience. That does not justify.
So how can you do it better?
I mean, what we have to do is recognize that when these horrors occur, the world has a responsibility to react in a way which will stop them, if possible, happening, and certainly react to them after the event. Whatever else we muck up in the conduct of international affairs, and my God, we're unintelligent about the way in which we conduct many aspects of our affairs, including perhaps some of the strategies that Alan's talking about. Whatever else we muck up, don't let's stand by again when these situations of mass atrocity crimes arise and leave us all lamenting that we just failed to act. It doesn't have to be military action. The Kenya case is very important because it shows that timely, effective diplomatic pressure can sometimes produce exactly the same result at less cost.
Yeah, and I keep wanting to know how you're going to move ahead with this. You mentioned Kenya, but look, I'm sorry, Darfur is still happening there. Yeah. The only thing people say, and maybe this is what you mean, is the indictment against the president led him to clean up a little bit in Darfur, but not much.
Darfur was really horrible in 2003, 2004. Military intervention, for reasons I've already spelt out, was not an option. International pressure, sanctions, legal pressure was an option, took a long time to be applied. When it was applied, it started to bite. And the reality we're seeing in Darfur at the moment is a far more accommodating environment. We're just not seeing the horror that we were before.
That is, some people say, because the horror has already been committed. But here's the thing. The United Nations Security Council is not and has not wanted in many, many instances and many, many cases to intervene. It's this whole idea of sovereign pride. And that's what R2P is challenging.
Yeah, but remember that it's not only challenging it in the abstract, it's won unanimous support of 191 countries in the UN General Assembly at President and Prime Minister level in 2005. There's been a fundamental conceptual shift. What for centuries was a view of sovereignty that whatever happened, however barbaric, behind state walls, remember Cambodia, remember all those earlier things, was nobody else's business. That view has changed. And of course there are problems of effective implementation. Of course we've got a long way to go. Of course we've got to get the Security Council behaving in a consistent fashion and not applying double standards. We want the world in all those ways to be a better place, but we've made a big step forward by getting that principle accepted. And in a big debate just a couple of weeks, 2 months ago, in the UN General Assembly, there were only 4 states which stood out against this principle. Guess who they were? Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and Sudan.
And do you think Russia would go for R2P?
Yeah, of course, they have.
Christian, can I address the Darfur question?
They called the R2P an aid wrongly in the case of Georgia.
You know, Darfur is another classic example of the R2P backfiring. There were peace negotiations in 2006. There was a peace agreement that was signed by the government, signed by one of the rebel groups, but it was rejected by the other 2 rebel groups. And when immediately afterwards the rebel leader was interviewed, this is Abdul Wahid al-Nur, and they asked, why did you reject the agreement? He said, I am waiting for larger international intervention, quote unquote, like in Bosnia.
All right.
So this prospect of intervention is not solving things. It's actually perpetuating civil wars.
Well, clearly, as Gareth Evans said, it's an absolute necessity when it comes to lives being lost. This is a conversation to continue, and we will do. But thank you very much.